listen up. All you ever ask for is an opportunity. You got it today. Where else would you rather be than right here, right now?
The Rockpile Report with Buffalo Bills season ticket holder Drew Gear.
Be aggressive. You have literally nothing to lose. You're a borderline football team. If I don't keep laughing about this stuff, my teeth are going to turn around and devour my brain.
The Bills make me wanna.
I don't know that Marquise Brown is worth drafting that high, but I would like to get a vertical receiver for a guy like Josh Allen, who has an arm like very few in the league and can exploit you defensively, especially with the ability to move around on broken plays. 1 or 2 plays a game can be like 7 or 9 plays from an efficient offense. So everything can go bad for 15 plays, and all of a sudden he breaks the pocket. It's like Roethlisberger. You give him Antonio Brown, who can get vertical, and all of a sudden, if you've got a guy down the field who's been able to, after 4 or 5 seconds, because your quarterback extended the play, to get down the field, and then he can make a throw. We saw it at Wyoming. We saw flashes of it this year. He can make some throws that very few quarterbacks we've ever seen in the league can make.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Rockpile Report podcast. I am your host, Bill's season ticket holder, Drew Gear. That's my producer, Chris Kruger, and that was Todd McShay from
ESPN First Draft, the podcast from ESPN's Pod Center. We are definitely not taking a wide receiver at 9. Even I know this. You do not draft or build an offense from the outside in. It's from the inside out. We need an interior lineman.
Folks, I can't even express my rage. We have a podcast to get to, but trust me, you're all going to hear about this.
I know, hand size, right around the corner.
Oh my God, I'll kill you too. First off, folks, I have to start this show by giving out a pair of thank yous. First and foremost, to Mike Swenson from Australia, down under, for giving me a sport worth watching at this point in the year. As Friday is the kickoff of the Queensland Reds rugby season. Lord knows the Sabres couldn't be relevant this time of year, and I would literally rather be stranded on the island from Castaway than watch more than 5 full baseball games in a given calendar year. So thank God I've got a real sport to focus on for the next, handful of weeks. It's going to be so much fun. So thank you, Mike Swenson. Also, to my wife, to her friend, and more importantly, to Mike Partham for making the trek out to Batavia Downs this weekend to have a beer or two with the old boy Drew Gear over at Batavia Downs at the Legends and Stars signing event. Chris, that was pretty cool.
It was slightly cool because, not for nothing, the director of marketing at Batavia Downs, his wife is friends with my ex-wife. So I got to see him. I haven't seen him in 3 years, so that was slightly awkward for me.
But everything that's slightly awkward for you is hilarious for me. Guys, in the time that we've spent doing this podcast, I've been afforded a lot of really cool and rewarding experiences. I really have been. From the sidelines of St. John Fisher to the press box at New Era Field to the 50-yard line, talking to players. It's been a ride. And Saturday, I got to check, Sunday, actually, I got to check another item off my bucket list. Now, first off, I want to say congratulations to the host of Rock Sports Network's The Huddle TV show, Ryan, as he recently celebrated the birth of his second child. Because of that, he was unable to make it on Sunday to host their show from Batavia Downs. They were the Legends and Stars signing event. They put together a great crop of just premier athletes from all 4 sports, Chris. Gilbert Perreault was there. Lawrence Taylor was there over the weekend. They had all kinds of Bill stars. They had basketball players there.
Yeah, I was talking to Gary during the recording of the show, and somebody walked behind you guys, and he looked at me and said, is that Dave Stewart from the A's? Yes, it is.
Guys, it was a big event for Batavia Downs, but it was even bigger for me personally, just to be there. With Ryan out, he was unable to make it, and I filled in for him as host of the show. Huge shout out to Gary from Rock Sports Network for giving me that opportunity. I'm happy you trusted me with it, and I hope that I didn't drive it like a drunk 16-year-old. Okay? It was a wildly fulfilling experience for me. I've got to give Ryan from Rock Sports a lot of credit. Facilitating conversation between other people, Chris, you saw it firsthand. It was something that was a little bit I was out of my element.
Oh, you were, because we could see you. That's all it comes down. We could see you.
But I'll say this. It was a great experience across the board. Coming in and out of breaks, learning how to host a show and facilitating conversation between other people instead of just being the mouthpiece. That's a little bit different for me, but it was a lot of fun. And it was an ultimately really rewarding experience, especially when you consider the highlight of the show was us getting to interview former Buffalo Bills legend Fred Smerlas.
My parents were insanely impressed. I sent him photos. My dad loved it. He was like, you interviewed Fred Smerlas? I'm like, yeah. Because that's when my dad paid attention to the Bills, was the 80s.
I mean, when this guy came walking over to the table to sit down with us, he looked every bit of 6'3" and almost looked like he could throw on shoulder pads right then and there and give everybody in the room a run for their money in an Oklahoma drill. He looked, Chris, for a guy his age, did he not look, he could take you in a heartbeat.
I don't know about that. I got a pretty good dad bod going on over here. But, I mean, he looked with it.
I mean, despite his noticeable Boston accent and his proclivity to tell us all about why we should appreciate Bill Belichick more, it was a lot of fun. Here are some of the highlights.
Folks, for those of you joining us at home, we are joined by Fred Smerlas.
Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for coming down.
Thank you for coming down.
Thank you,
You know what?
sir.
The chicken wings are pretty good.
Yeah.
You know that?
Okay, so first question, Fred. Now, I'm the elder statesman of the guys. I'm in my mid-40s, so I remember when you were here. Ranch or blue cheese? There's only one right answer, right?
Duh.
Is a longtime season
life's
ticket
unfair.
holder. I've been there for all of the games, and I've watched both him and Brady come in, and you leave angry. You watch Gronkowski run wild through your secondary. You watch Tom Brady come in and put up 300 yards and make it look easy every single time.
But the last game was 300 yards rushing.
Yeah.
So you know what he is now? He's an he orchestrates. So you come in there like they go to Kansas City. It's loud. It's cold. They're calling audibles with signs. No one's making a mistake.
Yeah.
He's changing the play to right, to left, to center. The Patriots come in, they're running upfield, they're running one gap, he's whamming them, he's trapping them, and he had 150 yards passing, and 300 yards running because that's what they give you. So there's not one thing he hasn't seen, and he figures it out and analyzes it and gets rid of the ball in 2.5 seconds.
Now I have to ask you. Now I have to ask you. Now that you have a chance to sit back and watch a guy like Tom Brady operate, are there any?
I do the post game for the Patriots, so I watch.
Exactly.
I was saying, yeah, you do the post game for the Patriots. I remember that.
You can see it from an external point. When you were on the field as a player, is there anybody else, any corollaries you can draw to somebody who reminded you or who handles the game the way Brady
Well, the game
does?
is different now, obviously, but don't forget the era I came in. We had Marino, Montana, we had Kelly. We had there was
the 83 class was insane.
Yeah.
The guy that was the freakiest of all was to me was Marino. No, he had those little midgets. They weren't great players. They were good. So you couldn't get to them. I remember we played on Buffalo. We had some coaches that were undesirable. Anyway, they must have been cheap. How many quarters did it take you to get that guy out of the bubblegum machine? But anyway, we're driving down the field, play after play after play. I think he did like 16 passes in a row. He looks at me and goes, Fred, you can't cover me. You can't zone me. I go, Meathead, I'm not calling the plays.
Yeah, right.
I'm just trying to get you. But his ability to read and react and get the ball. So what what makes the player great, everyone's big, everyone's strong. You know, I was 300 pounds, I benched 500 pounds.
Absolutely.
Right? I had great quickness. Everyone has that. But the ability to take in the information, right, and make it happen physically. So if I have to read a two-gap, guy steps that way. I don't care how big and strong you are. If you don't take the right step and have the right leverage, that guy's going to hook you.
Yeah. Now, for you, as a former player who now works around football, you were in the trenches and you understood what it was to play the game of football the way it was played back in the 90s and the 80s. There's a conversation around football that the game has changed and that the game is now essentially being played like flag football. There's a lot of dynamic passing concepts that are true, you know, quick screens, bubble screens, a lot of slants, a lot of things that are used to get the ball out quickly. And a lot of people argue that it devalues the defensive line and the offensive line, that it kind of takes away from what they bring to the game. Then you turn around and you watch a Super Bowl like we just saw, and it, to me, it underscores how important those lines are to just playing the game of football at a base level.
Yeah,
now, you as a guy who played in the trenches, what do you see as far as the biggest differences in the trenches from when you were going to now?
Well, I think it's a lot less technique and more overlap one gap. When we two gap, you're playing both sides of the center or two guys of a tackle. Then the options you can have off of that. If you have three guys that can two gap, you have two extra linebackers in cover. Yeah. Linemen are fat a lot. A lot of them are fat pigs. They can't play. They can't play. I played 98% of all plays. I played 300 pounds and 9% body fat. You could play the whole game. So the rotation is much different.
Guys, it was an incredible experience. If you want to see the interview in its entirety, I promise, he came with some heat. He had a lot of hot takes. He had some snark. It was great. I urge you to go over and check out the rest of the broadcast. Rock Sports Network on Facebook. That's where you get to go see the thing in its entirety. It was great. We will put a link to it in the show's description. I mean, Chris, I was buzzing afterwards, which is what drove me to the bar. and I mean, the rest of the story writes itself. I mean, I had a hell of an afternoon. It was a great day. Thank you so much to Gary, to Ryan, to everybody who just thanks for trusting me enough to not screw that up. And guys, with that, we're going to move into this week's Bills News Update. Tight end Charles Clay has been released. Chris, the first offseason domino that everybody saw coming has fallen, with the Buffalo Bills officially releasing tight end Charles Clay. The writing was on the wall all season. The guy is a veteran tight end, Chris. And I don't think that his struggles and his abominable return on investment can be understated enough. So I've broken them down for everybody, just in case there's anyone out there who might still feel bad for this guy. He was the 9th highest paid tight end in 2018. But if you take out the caveat for like number of catches or number of routes ran, and you look at pure yardage per tight end, he was 51st in the NFL. 51st! There's only 32 teams! Chris, how does it happen?
I have no idea. But to know that there were probably a couple of Jet tight ends ranked higher really grinds my gears.
All of them! Every tight end on their friggin' roster! I mean, think about this.
Metzelar's was ranked higher. He didn't even play.
Charles Clay had 184 yards receiving. That's it. No touchdowns, nothing. To put that into perspective, Greg Olsen from Carolina only played 9 games. He had 291 yards and 4 touchdowns. And speaking of touchdowns, 0 touchdowns on the season from a tight end who's been in the top 10 for pay. Do you know who had more touchdowns than he did, Chris?
I wish I could. I wish I knew the season, but I want to say the 2015 Kansas City Chiefs. Is that not the year that they
the ones who had no
ones that had like no touchdowns from a receiver?
Quarterbacks Matt Ryan and Ryan Tannehill had more receiving touchdowns than Charles Clay. There were 3 offensive tackles, including his teammate Deion Dawkins, who had more receiving touchdowns than Charles Clay. You don't even play the position. Chris, this is hysterical to me because I have to laugh. I have to laugh or else I'll just throw things. He was the worst return on investment of the year. Worse than Charles Clay. Excuse me, Jesus Christ, he is Charles Clay. Worse than LaShawn McCoy. Worse than Kelvin Benjamin. He made $6.5 million in actual cash earnings. $2 million bonus, $4.5 million in cash.
I hope they gave that all to him in briefcases full of nickels.
Like you did to me at my wedding?
Yes.
Asshole. No, Chris, do you know that with no touchdowns, the man made, if you want to just break it down to the only measurable statistic he has available, that means that Charles Clay made $309,523 for every catch that he had this season.
Could have had a lot.
With no touchdowns!
He could have had that in another catch against Miami, but that didn't happen.
God. He was 8th, Chris, 8th on the entire roster in yards per game. He finished 6th on the team in total yards. That's behind Kelvin Benjamin, who got cut, his eventual replacement, Kroom. He even finished behind our top 2 running backs.
I think Isaiah McKenzie covered more yards in a gator than he did actually receiving.
Chris, I think the most damning thing, here's the most damning statistic of Charles Clay's final season here in Buffalo. He finished 11th on the team in yards per touch behind Kyle Williams. Yes, defensive tackle Kyle fucking Williams produced more yards per offensive touch than tight end Charles Clay.
You are one pathetic loser.
That is absurd! Chris, that's unheard of. I've never had, in all of my years as a football fan, I don't know that I've watched a guy making more than $1 million a year have a season that pathetic. And everyone will say, oh, well, you know, you're not being very even-handed. What is there to be even-handed about? Someone explain this to me, in the words of Elf.
That's in the words of you, but, I mean, good luck to him in Arizona. They need a lot of help on the offensive line.
I mean, it's not shocking to see that Arizona picked him up. I mean, he's got a track record of performance in this one abysmal season. But with that said, his salary there, Chris, more accurately reflects what he brings to the table. I mean, he's making $3.25 million with nothing guaranteed, and I think a $300,000 signing bonus. That sounds about right for a guy who got outpaced on offense by a defensive tackle. That makes me want to put my face just into a wall. Like, I don't know what to do, Chris. It's infuriating as a fan to sit here and know that this team shelled out ungodly sums of money for nothing. Literally nothing. I mean, it's going to be shocking to see how Arizona tries to generate some kind of offense with him. At least if he plays. I mean, their new head coach, Cliff Kingsbury, better be an offensive genius if he's going to get this guy to contribute anything based on the way he played last year. Now, for the Bills, Chris, that leaves us in a weird spot.
Kroom?
Logan Thomas is out there as a free agent, and Jason Kroom is the only tight end currently under contract. I mean, we have one. Now, he provided a little bit of spark as a receiving option, but he is a drastically subpar inline blocker. So that means whether anybody out there likes it or not, the Bills are going to have to make an addition to the position in the coming weeks. They're going to have to. But luckily for us, there are plenty of options. I mean, you look at the free agent market right now. First of all, you've got some guys out there with some star power. Eric Ebron. Hey, hands up if Eric Ebron saved your fantasy football season. Lord knows I wrote him. I picked him up off waivers in week 2 or 3. 13 touchdowns and over 700 yards? Chris, that guy is going to get paid. Would you be mad if the Buffalo Bills spent heavily on the tight end position again?
I wouldn't, but my question to you would be, how much use does a tight end get in Brian Daboll's system?
Well, I've said flat out, I've spent years watching Alabama football, and the year that he was our offensive coordinator, they loved to use 2 tight end sets when they had 2 talented tight ends. I bet you if you could find some talent at those positions, he could find ways to work them into the offense. It's just a matter of, do we have the talent on hand? Eric Ebron, he's probably gonna get a significant payday. I'm not advocating that we go out and throw gobs of money at the guy. I think that if it's a reasonable deal, I'd like to see a dude who's capable of catching 13 touchdown passes. I'd like to see him in a Bills uniform. If it's not going to cost us an arm and a leg. That said, it probably will. The other name recognition tight end out there in the market is Jared Cook. Oakland guy, he at 32 years old, everyone kept talking about Jared Cook in fantasy football. Every year, Jared Cook was supposed to have his breakout year for the last 6 years.
I think I took him 5 years ago when he was with St. Louis.
Yeah, because every year he was supposed to. This was the year. This was the year. He finally had the year. Except he's 32 years old now. He's a 32-year-old tight end, but he's a name, so he's going to cost more. Luckily, there is a solid mix of affordable youth and experience at the position behind that. Let me run down the list for you real quick. First of all, Pittsburgh's Jesse James, who's probably best known for his touchdown that wasn't called a touchdown against the New England Patriots. Y'all remember that? Yeah, that guy. He is a great blocker, and he's also, I'd say, an above-average pass catcher for the tight end position. Picture a less dynamic Kyle Rudolph. That's a fair assessment of what Jesse James is. And if he's allowed to hit the market, and the Steelers don't re-sign him, that could be an attractive option to a team like ours, especially one that's trying to bolster its running game with a running back like LaShawn McCoy, who needs to get to the edges of a defense in order to be effective. Also out there, in the same mindset, Nick Boyle from Baltimore, staying with the AFC North. Fantastic blocker, but an average at best receiver. He's an option out there in the passing game, but I don't know how much good he's going to do you. But as a blocker, he's pretty great. And that's something that regardless, we only have one body at the position, Chris. That's it. That's all we have.
You got to know that we have to be signing.
That's what I'm saying.
A tight end.
There is there is at least one signing coming from free agency, which is why it's worth looking at these, because you need two. Even looking at what's available elsewhere, you're still going to need a guy who's proven he can do it, because Kroom still can't block. Another name on the list, Jeff Swaim. Now, first of all, I don't like anybody who spells his name Geoff. Geoff. I immediately assume you're soft. Okay? It's like the George Carlin bit. The name's Brendan, Kyle, and Todd. Nicky, Vinny, and Tony will beat up Brendan, Kyle, and Todd most days of the week. That's just that bit is 20 years old, and I still think it rings a little true.
There was a dude in my high school named Jeff, spelled that same way, and that's what we literally called him, Geoff. That was his nickname, Geoff.
Not only that, but he also reminds me of that idiot Jeff Schwartz. That guy can
Oh
suck
yeah,
it.
from FS1.
He can suck it. But that said, Jeff Swaim, coming out of Dallas, he's a blocker who's still young. He's 25. He excels at blocking. He's not much in the passing game, but he can maybe grow into it. Or maybe you pay him on the cheap as a blocking tight end. We
need the help on the offensive line to block.
And then there's an interesting option out there by the name of Tyler Kroft. Tyler Kroft, to me, is, I don't know. This is an interesting case, Chris, of do you buy low?
You definitely buy low, and he's not going to get any money in this free agency. He's going to have to sign low.
You're talking about a guy who, for those of you who don't know, former tight end, third-round pick for Cincinnati. He had to replace, Eifert, every single time he got injured. Every time he went out with injury, Croft would step in. In 2017, he had over 400 yards and 7 touchdowns. And he played in all 16 games. But last year, he got hurt and only played like a third of the season. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of money he commands, because he can also be a dynamic weapon. And when you give Dable 2 dynamic pass catchers, who can also block a little bit. He's known to scheme up some plays around that. And that's why it's going to be interesting to see how they address that in free agency. The draft is also an option, Chris. I mean, this is a strong crop of tight ends available in this year's draft.
How long does it take a tight end to get acclimated to the NFL game?
I don't know. Ask O.J. Howard. He was one of the leading receivers on Tampa Bay the year he was drafted. He murdered the Bills.
I remember that.
I said O.J. and murder.
I've always thought that I've read or heard that it takes tight ends a little bit longer to get acclimated from college to the NFL.
Well, it does. And that's one of the problems of trying to identify draft prospects who you think can help your team in the given year.
So, when you say, like, drafting a tight end, my mind immediately goes to a video that a friend of the show, Travis Wingfield, put out on Twitter. He's at Wingfield NFL. He put out a video of Mike Gesicki on the line. The snap happened, and like 2 seconds later, he starts moving off the line. He was just like way late, and so in my head, my mind is already acclimated that rookie tight ends take longer to develop, just based on that one video of Gesicki in the 3-point stance, and then everyone else is moving. Oh, I need to move now? Okay, let me run my route and then trip over myself.
In fact, if you follow at Wingfield NFL on Twitter, he has a ton of videos up there of Gesicki just ending up on the ground. He's like, I don't know what happens to this guy, but somehow he ends up on the ground during at least 2/3 of his routes.
Yeah, and
at some point during the play, he's just laying on the ground.
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of weary on the Bills taking a tight end to start this upcoming season if they do in the draft.
Well, I guess that's the question, Chris. Where is this team going to go? I mean, we're all sitting here trying to figure out what this team wants to do. Trying to figure out what their philosophy might be. I mean, Chris, between you and I, we've been sitting here having weekly conversations about it. And folks, for those of you listening, we've got just 2 months between us and the NFL draft. We're literally just a week away from the kickoff to our annual draft preview series. And we're still sitting here trying to figure out, what is it that Brandon Beane prioritizes?
Hey, Brandon! How dumb do you think I am?
So with that said, folks, I really think that it's worth laying the groundwork for the 2019 draft. And in order to do that, a part of it involves an analysis of team needs, ranking them by importance. I mean, Chris and I sit here every year before our draft conversation, and we kind of go back and forth over, because we try to put the most important positions when we do our positional preview series, the most important positions closer to the draft, those that we think maybe the team's not so high on farther away. And it's hard to find that balance when you don't really know what the team may view its needs. I mean, mock drafters everywhere can tell you what they think, but ultimately, how are we as laymen here who aren't draft professionals and never claim to be, how are we supposed to gauge what positions or what types of players our plain-spoken GM might value? Well, tonight we have a guest joining us who's going to try to help us parse through some of this information and, try to read the tea leaves. And that is Mr. Dean Kindig. Mr. Kindig, how are you doing tonight?
Fine, thanks. How about you guys?
Not bad at all, sir. It's been a long time since we spoke. Glad we have you.
I think we did this last year.
We did this last year, and we talked the year prior, and I'll tell you what, you saved me. For those of you out there who don't know Mr. Kindig, he is the editor-in-chief for Draft Tech. Dean, why don't you explain a little bit about what Draft Tech is and what you guys do?
Yes, we have 32 analysts on a good week, one for each team, and there are some guys that also work on a big board of right now 400 plus. We actually react to a computer making the picks. We give the computer lots of information, though. We give team needs, almost like a ranking, and then the big board is also ranked, and the computer shops at each pick for the best value for that player. Now we can change something afterwards, but basically we let the computer do the picks, we do the reaction, we get to comment. Right now we're commenting on the first 2 rounds at drafttech.com.
And now a lot of that data is input throughout. Folks, for those of you who don't already follow Dean Kindig's work, if you follow him on Twitter, and obviously we're going to plug his handle in the run up to the show, and I'm sure we're going to plug it throughout the show tonight, but he's scouting. He follows so much scouting data that goes into this, that gets input into this algorithm, which ultimately bears out these picks. So it's really interesting to see the amount of work that has to go into that, and through that harvesting of this data, you can kind of yourself, Dean, come up with some conclusions as far as what's going on in the scouting world, where certain teams are leaning based on who they're visiting, and that's really the bones of what we want to talk about tonight. He's also, folks, a big contributor over at BillsMafia.com. In their blog section, he writes draft pieces and things like that for their website. So it's interesting to see him write on both sides of this and see his takes on just scouting material as a whole. And I think for me personally, one of the reasons I value his opinion so highly when it comes to this stuff is because I wasn't a believer. I wasn't. And I certainly wasn't a believer in the Trey White draft. I thought Trey White was a gross missed opportunity for the Bills, not taking Reuben Foster. I said he's a cornerback. How good could he possibly be? He doesn't have elite size. He doesn't have any one elite trait. I don't know what I'm looking at. And he did this, and he sat me down and not only went over the metrics just from a scouting perspective on Trey White, but also on Matt Milano, explaining to me why hating both of those picks was that I was probably wrong. And sure enough, we turn around, look at them now. Right now, they're stalwarts for our defense. I mean, Chris, you remember those conversations.
Oh, yeah. We tried to do a draft show the year we drafted Trey White, and that all went to crap. It's just a file that sits on my computer now. You just took everything out on me because we didn't take Reuben Foster, and we took Trey White.
And in retrospect, I was wrong. People were right. And you were right for steering me in the right direction, Dean. So it's interesting to get to pick your brain about some of this stuff again and look at some of the work you've been doing this season and kind of putting together the data that goes into your scouting algorithms. So to really kind of kick this thing off, in previous years, if we were trying to read the tea leaves, so to speak, when I look at the run up to the draft, you're trying to follow the trail of breadcrumbs that's being left by the organization as far as what they're doing, who they're visiting with. I think back to Doug Whaley. Doug Whaley was infamous because he had some tells. He had, there was a certain type of school he would scout every single season, and he stuck to those pretty steadily. And he had other tells, like he only drafted players that came in for an official visit. One of the 21 official visits you get in the offseason. The problem I have with this group heading into this season is that to my layman's eye, and it's only his second full draft, I can't pick up anything on Brandon Beane. I can't. Yeah. He doesn't, to my eye, I don't see anything that they do that I don't see a pattern here. Now, I know one of the things, I saw some tweets from you and I saw some different things from you in your articles over the course of the offseason. I want to start off with scouting visits. When we get to talking about what this department and what Brandon Beane's front office is really looking for this offseason, I think that one of the most easily traceable pieces of data out there is finding out what schools the scouts visit. Now, how much time did you spend looking into this over the course of the year?
That comprises a lot of what I do because I don't find it anywhere else. So I say, okay, I'm providing a service here. I'll keep doing this. Chase Goodbread at NFL does tweet out the places that credentialed scouts go, and he'll tell you which teams are visiting. For instance, the Wyoming-New Mexico State game, August 25th. He'll give you some clues, and then it's basically legwork because I look at the box score. I watch the video of the game. I try to figure out, well, who would they be looking at? Taking that as an example, one of the players that came up was Andrew Wingard, a strong safety. He'll be a day 3 player, but he did really well. He plays the game like the Bills safeties do. That would be a possibility.
So he's a guy that the scouts were there in games that he played well, and so it's reasonable to believe that that's a guy that could be on his radar.
Right.
Now, when I look at this, first of all, I look back to previous regimes and I try to establish another set of, like a template in my mind of what this team might be thinking. The last regime showed a lot of conference bias. And when I say that, here's what I mean. First of all, look at how many, first and foremost, the SEC. I understand that there's a lot of SEC players who get drafted, but specifically Alabama. Look at 3 players, and they were all failed projects and draft picks drafted out of Alabama by the previous regime. You have offensive tackle Cyrus Kwanjo, linebacker Reggie Ragland, defensive tackle Marcel Darius. The one thing these guys all have in common is that they all played for Alabama and that they all played on championship or championship caliber rosters. So I get it. There was some bias shown there. They obviously had a lot of scouting of those games, and they focused on guys who came from those types of teams. And then you take a look back at the rest of his drafts. The ACC was a favorite of Doug Whaley's. And it bears out when you look at the draft picks. I mean, in 2015, the entire draft class came from the ACC. The whole thing. I think outside of one pick, I think it was Des Lewis, was the only non-ACC player. In 2014, 3 of the first 4 picks, all ACC players. And then the year before that, and it's hard to know whose pick this was, obviously nobody really, after the fact, nobody wanted to take, whether it was Buddy Nix, whether it was Doug Whaley, nobody wanted to take responsibility for it, but E.J. Manuel, another ACC player. So, in your review of the scouting, where scouts are going, have you witnessed anything, any kind of conference bias? I mean, anything that you've seen that would kind of lead you to believe that there's a certain conference around the country that the Bills scouts have focused on?
First of all, the SEC and the ACC are definitely in the mix. Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina have each received a visit. Alabama 3 times, and Ole Miss 1 time each, but Brandon Beane attended those games involving Ole Miss and South Carolina. We'll get into that, who that might be. Mm-hmm. Georgia and LSU were also visited twice each. Beane did not go to those games. You'd have to go to the Pac-12 and the Big Ten to find the other places that were visited more than once. Oregon got visited twice. Ohio State got visited twice, and Beane attended that game. And Michigan, also from the Big Ten, got visited twice. Those are the biggies. Beane also attended a game of West Virginia's and Oklahoma's, and that might be important as well, especially when we talk about receivers.
That's really interesting here, and it's interesting on a couple different levels, because when I think about it, again, we get back to this conversation about team needs. That's where you really start looking into, okay, there are premier players who obviously play for these squads. I mean, they're Power 5 conference teams. They're going to have elite players at a lot of different levels. But when you say, as you're reading these off, I bet you everyone who's listening to this podcast right now just had 4 to 5 names fly through their head as far as, I think I know why he's there, or I think I know why this is or that is, which is the purpose of this entire exercise. It's finding out, trying to see the pattern that's evolving over what games were prioritized over others. Now, before we get into specific players, were there any, obviously Power 5 conference teams are going to receive a bulk of the scouting work, because that's where the cream of the crop is. Most of the time, I should say. I don't want to take anything away from the smaller schools. Did you notice that there was any smaller schools in particular that were getting attention from the Bills scouting staff?
I have 3. One is the University of North Alabama. It was Division I FCS team, and they paid a visit there to a safety. That's interesting in itself. Chris Johnson is his name. He'll be a day 3 or preferred free agent, and to me that's cool because he's already figuring out who he'd want for preferred free agents if they weren't drafted. So this is much more thorough than Whaley used to do. I can tell you that just by sheer numbers of games that they went to and the sheer number of players that they've already looked at. Another team is Wyoming in the Mountain West. It's the only team in the Mountain West they visited. The only team in the MAC they seemed to been to was Buffalo, and I believe it was when they played Rutgers. Is Buffalo in the MAC?
Buffalo is in the MAC, and we have, and that's interesting because there's two different NFL caliber players. I mean, obviously there's other guys who might be in the mix, but there's 2 draftable players from the UB team this year. One is a quarterback, very athletic guy. I'm not going to lie to you though. When I watch his game and when I see because again, it's here in our own backyard. You hear and you see so much of it. He strikes me as a Terrell Pryor. He strikes me as a Logan Thomas, more athlete than quarterback at the NFL level. That's not to say he can't contribute, but that also said there's a 6'2" wide receiver that seems to be getting his name into the mix in a lot of different draft boards and a lot of draft conversations as far as the wide receiver position. So with knowing what a need that is for the Buffalo Bills, it's not a stretch to think, hey, it's right here in our backyard. We might as well go kick the tires on this and see what they have to offer.
Very, very true. You figure out what didn't the wide receivers provide last year? One of them was catch rate, and the other one was separation at the line. And those two would be very important when you start looking at catch rates of wide receivers. I'm doing an article right now for Bills Mafia that might drop tomorrow about the wide receivers that did the best in the games that were scouted. They're not all big names. They're all over the map in terms of what round they'll be drafted in.
Well, the crazy thing about the wide receiver position, though, is that for every Mike Williams and Corey Davis who exist out there, who go top 10 because they're physical freak athletes, who like a DK Metcalf this year, who are freak athletes and just they bring physical traits that you just can't replicate.
Yep.
There are a ton of guys like Robert Foster who fly under the radar for one reason or another just because, hey, you don't have elite size. Kind of like my argument about Trey White. That you don't have elite size. You don't have any one thing that, to me, again, as a layman who looks at this stuff, there's nothing special looking about you from, 100-foot glance. But at the same time, that's why these guys get paid to do this, is because they're there to identify talent that with the right coaching can flourish at the NFL level.
Exactly.
So with that, now that you've had a chance to now that we've kind of reviewed where they've scouted, I guess one of the questions I walk away from this is that out of these schools, as you're kind of connecting the dots in your head, going through all this data and going through all the different stuff you've compiled, have you noticed any correlation from one team to the next team to the next team? Is there any kind of, is there an offensive or defensive style that a lot of these teams that have been scouted the most seem to share? Are there any coaching philosophies that might match up from one team to the next? Anything like that we can use to kind of start stringing these things together?
I think I know what you're talking about. That would really come into play with the interior defensive line, because not all of the players play the 4-3, and not all of the players play the Lotulelei type of style where the defensive line is basically there to get the linebackers freed up.
Yep.
So there'll be some of these players in the interior defensive line will go, oh, we've got to have him. Good example might be Rashawn Gary. He may not be the best for this team. If you're looking for sacks, it's going to be somebody like Ed Oliver or defensive end like Christian Rector. But if you're looking for somebody who's going to collapse the pocket just with explosive strength, hey, Ed Oliver in the first round wouldn't be bad if he drops to us.
I don't know. And so I guess when you look at that, that's what we're trying to figure out is who is it that they could possibly be targeting, and how does the team, how might the team prioritize some of these targets out there? Now, it sounds an awful lot like based on the schools that you listed off, there are a lot of big name schools that they've kind of prioritized, and the SEC seems to be getting a lot of love. Now, that's understandable because the SEC, for better or worse, the SEC's offense isn't known for being overly explosive. I mean, outside of Alabama, there's not a whole lot of SEC teams that are putting up 40 points a game. I mean, is that fair?
You make a good point.
So, with that said, you're going into a defensive-heavy draft. It makes a lot of sense then that if that's where you think, I mean, and we've heard Brandon Beane say it, we've replayed the clip multiple times in this podcast.
Judicious?
Judicious, well, not just judicious spending, but also that he does not think drafting for need, leave your team essentially picking up bit players instead of superstars at different positions. You need to draft the best talent available. In a deep defensive draft, then, if that's the case, and he truly believes that, then it would make sense that he's scouting a lot of SEC talent, because when you look at the SEC, those defenses play some tough physical football. I mean, I would argue, I mean, you take a division like the SEC and you weigh it against something like the Big 12. Nobody plays defense in the Big 12. If you're going to scout in the Big 12, it sure as hell isn't for defense. I mean, every team in the Big 12 can score 40 points on a given day. That's how bad things are over there. And it's also a combination of bad defense and a ton of spread option teams. Whereas to survive in the SEC, you have to be able to play head on a hat trench warfare football. And that's the style of football that most accurately translates, especially when you're talking about defense and line play, to the NFL. So that makes a lot of sense. They're playing to the strength of the draft, which is why again and again and again, Dean, I try to caution Bills fans that if you think that this is going to be the draft where they go out and pick up every single wide receiver you've ever heard of, or they just draft, you think they're going to go out and draft everybody, every skill player under the sun simply because their offense was bad last year, you're going to be, you need to find a pillow to cry into, because you might be sorely disappointed.
If you're looking for the jersey that you're going to buy to come from round one or maybe even round two, you may be sorely disappointed. I fully agree.
Exactly. What you're going to find is a lot of dirty in the trench. I mean, that's where this draft is heavy. The guys, now see, those are the guys I'd buy the jersey for because I appreciate that aspect of football.
Here's a little discovery I made last week. Of my top 17 interior defensive linemen, the Bills scouts have seen all of them.
Really?
That will depend on where you have Charles O'Menahue and Kalen Saunders. I have those right outside that list, but they have seen a lot of them. They went to Houston where Ed Oliver is. They went to Alabama where Quinnen Williams is. They talked to Daniel Wise at the Senior Bowl. Clemson with Christian Wilkins, Michigan Rashawn Gary, Notre Dame 3 times, Jerry Tillery. Those would be my 6 that I would see in the first round that they might take on the interior. And they're good edge players. But again, free agency has good edge players. So.
Well, and that's just it. And see, that's worth noting. And I guess that's the other side of this coin. So now we've kind of, throughout this conversation, we've established that there are certain schools that are getting more love than others. And I think it's worth noting, to your earlier point, some of these schools have gotten attention not just from the scouting department, but from Brandon Beane himself. That carries some gravitas to it, right? I mean, there is something there when the GM of a football team says, I'm going to go see this specific game. He trusts his scouting department. And I would say that so far, his collegiate scouting department, those guys have proven to be rock stars. So far.
They have, especially in the last rounds
Exactly, especially in the late rounds. That's where we're making hay, which has never been the case over the course of the last decade. You go back, I mean, I usually joke, the worst pick for the Buffalo Bills in the last 12 to 15 years has been the 4th round. You can literally take you should take the pick and throw it away if you're the Marv Levy Buffalo Bills. If you're the Buddy Nix, we drafted some guys who, when I start just regurgitating names of guys who were 4th round draft picks for the Buffalo Bills, nobody knows who the hell I'm talking about. It's because when they finished here, they never saw a pro contract after that. That's how bad things were for us from scouting.
Pathetic.
So now you look
think about it, at the end of day 2, Bean still has 7 more picks.
And that's it. That almost plays to our strengths so far from the last few years of drafting. I mean, you can argue that the wide receiver pickups from the end of last year's draft didn't pan out. I wasn't happy about them. And but that's what these undersized, speedy receivers, that's what you're going to get. But there was something there that he was looking for. And instead, he went out and found it mid-season off the waiver wire in Isaiah McKenzie. He knew he wanted a small guy with special teams utility who had some almost scat back type ability. And he found it. Whether it was in the draft, whether it was mid-season, that's a piece that Bean thought was important to this team. So now, I guess the other question to this is, first of all, how important are the Bean visits then when you take a look and say, okay, if you're watching Oklahoma, you just read off a list to me. If you saw an Oklahoma game, he certainly wasn't there for a defensive player. If you were at West Virginia, you're not scouting a quarterback, but I'm going to guess it's probably a playmaker on their offense.
Right.
South Carolina, I don't know a whole lot about South Carolina, but I know
Samuel.
But what I was going to say, but I know for Ole Miss, once again, Ole Miss wasn't a terrible team this year, but they sure as heck weren't turning anybody's heads.
They have the 3 wide receivers, DK Metcalf, A.J. Brown, and DeMarcus Lodge. They also have Greg Little, the offensive tackle. Mm-hmm. I also, near the end of the draft, I like Josiah Coatney. He can play 5-tech or 3-tech. He'd be one of those guys that he'd love to steal and have him be, a rock star.
Now, these players and I guess that's the question. First off, when we get to talking about specific players then that they might be zeroing in on, guys, I'm talking about names that Bills fans who are listening to this right now should probably pencil down somewhere, keep in the back of your mind, because these could be, like I said, we're trying to read tea leaves here. But when you're taking the information you have at hand, guys that this team very likely could be interested in. First off, Ole Miss, you just ran down the wide receiver group and the offensive tackle position. Those are really the only draftable guys on that roster, or at least guys of note. But now for South Carolina, tell me a little bit more about this visit and why it's important that Brandon Bean was there.
I think it was the fact that Deebo Samuel is one of those enigmatic players.
Now, what position does he play?
But there's nobody else. There's nobody else that even compares that was there. I'm going to discourage people against Deebo Samuel for a couple of reasons. He has a coin flip catch rate of 49%. He only has 1 year of play versus any AP teams, AP ranked teams. He was a Senior Bowl contact as well as being observed.
Okay, so they've had multiple, I guess, chances to put their eyes on him.
Like I said before, they're looking for somebody who can release. Well, he can release. He's also a kick returner.
So if anybody knows, Chris.
Terrence McGee, the last great kick returner we had.
I was going to say, if anybody loves a player who has utility, as far as the ability to do 2 jobs for the price of 1, it's Sean McDermott. Sean McDermott loves guys. If you can play center and guard, if you can play defense and special teams, if you can play offense and special teams, then you are a McDermott guy. I mean, it's just...
He wrestled like Harrison Phillips.
Oh, Jesus. That's it. Exactly. That's it. If you have utility, you might be a guy for us. So that makes sense then that they might be there just trying to get eyes on him. Now, if out of the rest of the visits, you're talking about the Mountain West, especially these small schools. Why don't you give me both offense and defense? Give me 2 players on offense and 2 players on defense that you think that Bills fans might want to start paying attention to in this run-up to the draft and keep in mind based on the scouting patterns that you've witnessed.
That they may not know or that they will?
You know what? Maybe some that are maybe a little bit under the radar.
First of all, the Georgia visit interests me, and there are a number of players that, because they're in the SEC and because they were visited twice, they may want to look at Riley Ridley, the wide receiver, and the strong safety J.R. Reed, and the running back Elijah Holyfield. And if the name Holyfield rings a bell, you know why.
His father was
there's one more that I think could be a backup to Latulele, and it's Tyler Clark. So there are some players. I don't know if they went there to see DeAndre Baker, the cornerback, because I think that's too early.
Where is DeAndre Baker slated to go as far as most conventional draft thoughts?
We have him going in the first round. So
okay, so that's probably a little too rich for our blood.
I think he's the second corner. I'd love to be in a situation where we're looking at corner in the first round because all of our needs are filled, but let's dream on.
So what you're saying is this Holyfield is interesting. Now, where is this running back slated to be drafted if you're looking at, just based on your current charting?
Right now, we have him going 111 to Green Bay, so that would be the 4A pick for Buffalo.
Chris is super excited. You can't see it, guys, but Chris is fist pumping over here because he guessed before Dean said 4. He flashed from the number 4, and now he's proud of himself because he thinks he knows something.
Yeah. Believe me, there'll be lots of value on day 3 for running backs. The need just isn't there this year. Of the 32 analysts on Draft Tech, there are like 5 that say it's a top need or a second need.
Well, and so I guess that's a question in and of itself. When we're breaking this down and you're talking about players, I mean, because we as fans kind of take to ourselves and say, we think we know what this team needs. I'm guilty of it myself. But then again, the draft comes and we take a cornerback instead of a linebacker, and I want to put my head down and run through a wall. Out of frustration.
You want to have one of those foam bricks.
Chris has seen it. Wicker furniture doesn't stand a chance around me. I turn into a Hurricane Andrew is what I turn into. And it's one of those things where I'd like to think I know better, but this regime specifically has taught me. I was a huge fan of the Whaley era. This era, I've hated all of the draft picks, and a lot of them have panned out, especially the ones I dislike the most. So when you're talking about the offensive players, it's interesting to see you point out a bunch of wide receivers. The Riley Ridley, that's a great example of a guy who isn't getting as much press as the DK Metcalfs of the world. He's got pedigree. Yeah. He comes from a wide receiver. His brother is a great young wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons. And at the same time, he did flash ability. And he's a guy who might go in that second round range. He may not be one of... Or if you facilitate a trade back, he may be one of those guys. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, what are a couple names kind of under the radar prospects that Bills fans throughout the course of the first handful of rounds? Obviously, first round, that's the one everyone focuses on. Every talking head out there has this is my mock draft. Your mock draft is only 32 picks and it's all hearsay. I'm interested in the nuts and bolts of this draft where we have A, the most picks, and B, we seem to derive a lot of value from. So if you had a couple value names on defense that you think that just based on our scouting patterns and what you've seen, we might want to get to know in this run up to the draft, who would they be?
You'd want to get to know Anthony Nelson, edge rusher out of Iowa, and DeAndre Walker, defensive lineman. But he also plays as outside linebacker as well, I believe.
Okay.
Those two would be third round.
Now, where did DeAndre Walker go to college?
Man, I want to say Georgia. I'm gonna have to peek at that one.
I love that you're just doing this on the phone, it's on the fly with none of your materials. Like
edge rusher, Georgia. He might even be a pretty good strong side linebacker in a 4-3.
Kind of filled
Right
that
now,
Lorenzo Alexander role.
Georgia 3-4, so it's not a perfect fit. They saw him twice and they saw Jalen Jelks twice. Makes me think they're looking deeper into this edge class than first round. They're probably giving up on Nick Bosa being there, and probably Josh Allen and Cleveland Farrell. They're probably giving up on those even being there at 9. We should trade down.
Well, and not only that, not even just a trade down, but it's nice to know that there's other, because this is, again, we're talking about a deep class. And I guess that's why I wanted to pick your brain about this tonight. Not just to get some of the scouting patterns out there, see the teams and talk about the types of players that they might be taking a look at, but to express the fact that there is more to this draft. There's more to every draft than just the first round. A ton of work goes into this by a ton of people. And there's a reason that, I don't know, there's a reason that these scouts fly all over the country and do the work that they do. And there's a reason why on draft day, most analysts and pundits and people who do mock drafts end up looking stupid. The idea behind this is just studying the prospects and getting to know them. And it's easier as Bills fans to prep for a draft like this when you can kind of open up. You're not just taking what the mainstream talking heads are giving you, and you can kind of open up to other players and other possibilities, especially at positions like wide receiver, like defensive line, like offensive line. I mean, I'm assuming the Oklahoma visit for Brandon Beane. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that's probably like a Cody Ford. Their offensive line, what? They were the best offensive line in college football? Is that correct? They won the award?
There are 2 players that he has scouted in every round. This is very encouraging to me. I get excited about this. Every round through the 4th round, he has 2 players that he thinks are going to be there. And it's like, right, Cody Ford in the first round with two trade down guys that might be there, Cajuste and Garrett Bradbury, the center, Dalton Risner, who got the talk at the Senior Bowl, Elgton Jenkins in the 2nd round, Chris Lindstrom in the 2nd or 3rd, Tyrese St. Louis in the 3rd round.
Like all of these offensive linemen could come in and be useful pieces to this team. And that's what I guess I like seeing this process evolve rather than just taking all my cues from ESPN. I like talking to guys like you about this.
Oh, I spend far too much time. ESPN, they probably do, but they don't.
No, that's it. I mean, hell, that's my complaint with WGR. My biggest complaint with mainstream radio is that you spend so much time talking and you fill up the air with all these words and you don't do any of the legwork to make it valuable. I mean, that's I guess my axe to grind. But Dean, I love what you do. Tell our listeners where they can find you on Twitter so that they can follow more of this work of yours on Twitter in the run-up to the draft.
My handle is at TCBills_Astro. And it's because I write the Astro notes over at St. John Fisher, a summary of the day's practice. I live 5 minutes away, so it's easy for me.
Yeah, folks, if you're ever out at training camp, just look for Dean. You'll see him in the stands taking notes.
Dean, don't you stay in like one of the top corners? And you always have a notebook?
Go up to the far corner, top row. I'm the only one with a clipboard in the whole freaking college. So I'm easy to spot. The other place to look for me is at billsmafia.com. I've written a good one over there called Astros Scouting the Scouts. And basically I went through every game and told you who they probably were looking at. Give you a little box score and highlight video for every game that the Bills scouted, who my best guess from that game is. So folks, that's probably a good one.
Folks, it's incredible work that this guy is doing. Make sure you give him a follow and go check it out. BillsMafia.com. Go check out his. It's crazy to see how much work this scouting department puts in behind the scenes that the average fan knows nothing about, and also the amount of work guys like Dean do, trying to chart this all out for us. I mean, it's a thankless job, but somebody's got to do it, right, Dean?
Yeah, go to drafttech.com right now. There's a 7-round draft, and almost every pick has been a scouted player. I made sure of that. So that would be the place to go. And spoiler alert, we took Ed Oliver and Irv Smith Jr., the tight end, followed by Eric McCoy, and then it gets interesting. So, yeah, check out drafttech.com. All the analysts do a lot of work. Of course, I do the most.
All right, you can follow Dean Kindig on Twitter at TCBills_Astro.
Folks, like Chris, who just does things that infuriate me and says things that drive me insane. We opened tonight's show with Todd McShay. And there's a reason. Chris, a question. What do the talking heads at ESPN and NFL Network and every single SB Nation, Vox, Draft, USA Today, Draft Wire, fan page writer, and every wannabe scout and draft pundit who's not too cheap to pony up $20 to host their own website all have in common?
They all do mocks. Your favorite.
Mock drafts! The scourge of the football fan. Mock drafts. Guys, we have reached an unfortunate part of tonight's show. The part where I have to get my annual mock draft rant off my chest. I mean, Chris, I genuinely thought we would make it farther into the offseason without this becoming necessary.
Oh, it's going to be necessary for the next 8 weeks. That's all you're going to hear about.
We're not even at the damn combine. We're not even at the combine. Teams haven't signed free agents. Nobody has made a major addition to their roster to address areas of significant need. We don't know what veteran player is signing where. We don't know who's going to suffer what injury or who's going to smoke and drink their way out of draft relevance. We know nothing. And yet, like death and taxes, we have mock drafts. Mock drafts upon mock drafts upon mock drafts. Some of these idiots are out here even trying to forecast trades.
What? What an idiot. Oh, what a loser.
The life cycle of a mock draft is even more absurd. First of all, the pundit / draft guy, they crap out a bunch of opinions and call it a mock draft. People then take their time to read said opinions. Those readers then feel the need to discuss those opinions with others and argue and debate and just waste entire gigabytes of the internet and even more of the oxygen that we as human beings need to survive. Chris, and I just die inside. I die a little bit inside every single time I see it. It's not that I don't get it. These massive sports conglomerates have run out of things to talk about. There is nothing going on at ESPN right now. Nothing. They are leaning on tonight's college basketball game. That's it. That's all of the discussion. What? There's no baseball. They don't give a shit about hockey. What is there to talk about for them? So they invented this churn of mock drafts. And then, because they do it, I mean, that gets all the eyeballs on their product. And because they do it with all their hot takes and everything else, every wannabe publication out there, like lemmings off a fucking cliff, decides that they gotta follow them. Chris, I've organized a list of things that I would rather give my undivided attention to than mock drafts. And they're ordered like this. First of all, I'd rather listen to you, Chris, rationalize the fact that you used to subscribe to a monthly cologne service.
Yeah, I stopped using that because they
You should have stopped using it before you ever started.
Hey,
oh my God.
I got some great scents back there.
You're an idiot. Oh, this Scentbird thing is nonsense.
Dolce & Gabbana light blue.
Oh,
Killer.
I'd like to see you dragged behind a horse for this. I'd also like to just sit down and watch a 2-hour documentary on how toothbrushes are made. I would also prefer to watch a one-man reenactment of the movie Deliverance. Okay? One man, one stage, one act. There you go. I would watch that before reading mock drafts. This is all ridiculous. I can't stop you all out there for submersing yourselves in them. I mean, it's the off season. There's no football news until free agency. And even then, mock drafts are all the rage because they've got you all hooked. Every widow, peaked-haired, witch nose having, just male pattern baldness asshole with an opinion and a microphone with a tie on.
Well, don't forget Todd McShay. He's got orange skin. He has the same skin tone as our president.
I can't stop you guys from paying attention to this, but here's what I can do. I can yell it from the mountaintop over here and hope that someone out there is chuckling as they're listening to this and at least sort of agrees with me. Chris, this whole pre-draft process,
we'll get it started next week. Next week, we're going to, Drew and I are going to do a Wonderlic challenge.
Oh, Jesus. The Combine is next week, folks. And in honor of the Combine, our annual 12-pack Wonderlic challenge. That's right. Chris, myself, a 12-pack, and the Wonderlic. I mean, so much gets made about how quarterbacks do or don't do well on this test.
Yeah, Ryan Fitzpatrick, perfect. I think Vince Young got like a 6.
The only thing that's important is that last year, I beat Chris by 1 point.
Yeah, I think we still both had like the intellect of a janitor.
Be that as it may, we're gonna run it back for another year. Guys, make sure you tune in and check it out. And also make sure you give Dean Kindig a follow on Twitter. Go check out some of his work. If you're into the draft, if you really want to get into it without a ton of the bloviated nonsense about the draft that ESPN and a lot of these other horseshit outlets are going to give you, go check out his work. It's at TCBills_Astro. Link in tonight's show description. DraftTech.com and at BillsMafia.com. That's where some of his best work is. When you're talking about actually getting breakdowns of who we've scouted, how they did, games that the Bills scouts were at, what players did well and might have stood out to them. It's really interesting. It's more interesting to me than any fucking mock draft. Chris. This whole thing is like me just getting clubbed for the next 2 months. It's like I'm just getting beat. I feel that this whole pre-draft process, I am like Gomer Pyle in Full Metal Jacket, and I'm just tied down to my bunk, getting beaten with bars of soap until this entire thing is over. With that, guys, we got to get out of here. I'm Drew Gear. That's Chris Kruger, and this has been the Rockpile Report.